do this with you guys is because there is a great deal of fear that comes with working and heading into some of your professions, into getting into operations, into working in dangerous environments. And so this is one of the topics that is commonly associated with that. What happens when a prison environment blows up, right? And we have unrest in the facility with that many offenders. How do corrections officials design strategies for management of that big animal? And again, what happens when it goes south? So our presentation today is, I'm going to lead with a video that kind of details just a foundation of the topic and what some of the triggers are to events like that, what correctional administrators watch for when they're managing their populations, and then I'll introduce a great friend of mine who we're welcoming to the campus today. So we'll get going on that, and then we will invite Gina.
In September of 1971, inmates rioted at the Attica Correctional Facility in New York. They seized control of the maximum security prison for most of the day. The police retook most of the prison, but over 1,000 inmates held 39 prison employees hostage in an exercise yard for the next 4 days. When the police finally raided, 10 hostages and 29 inmates were killed. Attica is the worst prison riot in U.S. history and resulted in a total of 43 deaths between the original riot and the police raid. A prison riot is an act of combined defiance or disorder by a group of inmates against the prison staff or another group of prisoners. Not all prison disturbances are classified as riots. A riot occurs when a significant number of inmates control a significant portion of a prison for a significant period of time. The prison administration decides what is significant enough to be classified as a riot. Prison riots can be caused by many different things, but riots are usually meant to force change within the prison or express a grievance. Some common causes of prison riots include poor responses or no responses to inmate complaints and requests or other unmet inmate needs, violent tendencies of some inmates or failure to respond to inmate incidents, failure to control contraband such as drugs, alcohol, weapons, and tools, inconsistent enforcement of rules by prison staff or unclear rules, poor prison management or frequent staff turnover, vague or changing lines of authority and administrative responsibility, high-level administrators who are not available to inmates and staff, lack of meaningful programs or activities for inmates, the stresses and effects of overcrowding, gang activity, racial tensions, or other tensions between prison groups. For example, the Attica inmates were expressing a number of grievances regarding their rights and living conditions. The Attica inmates were specifically frustrated with the overcrowded conditions, their letters being censored, their access to showers being limited to once a week, and their allowance of toilet paper being limited to 1 roll per month. During hostage negotiations with the police, the Attica inmates demanded improved living conditions, more religious freedom, an end to male censorship, and expanded phone privileges. Now let's take a look at the stages of prison rioting. Prison riots aren't common. However, when riots occur, they typically progress through 5 different stages. The stages are explosion or initiation, organization or expansion, confrontation or siege, termination, reaction, and explanation. A prison riot typically starts with an explosion or some sort of initiation or eruption of defiance and disorder. For example, in the Attica riot, the explosion of disorder came when inmates were moving to breakfast. A few inmates overpowered their guards and stormed down a prison hallway. The inmates pushed through a broken gate and into a central area of the prison, giving them access to all of the cell blocks. The explosion is the beginning of a riot, usually marked by mob violence and destruction. This is the most dangerous stage of a riot because inmates often take hostages, start fires, build barricades, and take over portions of the prison. The explosion stage may involve only one group of prisoners. Others may stay in their cells or be in a different part of the prison, unaware of the riot. However, the second stage of the riot incorporates more inmates. This stage is organization, or expansion. In this stage, the inmates are informally organized into inmate-led groups, and the riot expands to include more inmates. During Attica's Stage 2, many of the prison's 2,200 inmates joined the riot. They stormed through the prison, beating guards and acquiring weapons. They even burned down the prison chapel. Typically, unofficial riot leaders will come forward, while other inmates will assume other roles. As the riot progresses, the inmates will attempt to overtake areas of the prison, while prison staff attempt to establish control. Stage 2 marks the first struggle for power between the leadership of each group. Some inmates may even claim to be spokespersons or negotiators on behalf of the rioters. This is helpful to the prison staff, who will want a point person with whom to communicate and negotiate. The third stage is known as the confrontation or the siege. During this stage, the inmates will have either a physical or a verbal altercation with prison authority. At Attica, the police used tear gas and automatic weapons to regain control of all but one area. The rioters were cornered in an exercise yard surrounded by high walls and guard towers. But they held nearly 40 blindfolded hostages, and they were armed with clubs and knives. Often, at least one riot leader will emerge to present a list of grievances and demands from the inmates. This is the stage of negotiations. Violence typically decreases, but not always. At Attica, the Stage 3 negotiations stretched on for 4 days. Prison officials agreed to the inmates' demands for improved living conditions. However, government officials would not agree to grant amnesty to all inmates in the exercise yard, or provide those inmates with safe passage to a non-imperialist country. When police attempted to take the exercise yard by force, 39 people were killed, and another 89 were seriously injured. Eventually, all prison riots end. Stage 4 is known as termination. Termination means the riot ends through negotiation, physical confrontation, or surrender. At Attica, we know the riot ended through physical confrontation. Physical confrontation is the most dangerous way to end a prison riot. There are other options in other situations. The Joliet prison riot of 1975 was caused by prison gang members protesting their transfers to other prisons. That riot ended through negotiations. The 1980 New Mexico prison riot was caused by overcrowding and poor living conditions. After 2 days of failed negotiations and the death of 33 inmates, the riot ended through surrender. Most inmates simply quit rioting and left the riot area. Stage 5 is reaction, or investigating, processing, and explaining the riot. This is done by a government agency or investigative commission. The agency will attempt to identify the cause of the riot and identify measures necessary to prevent future prison riots. This stage also includes repairs to the prison and medical care for those injured during the riot. Let's review. violence or disorder by a group of inmates against the prison staff or another group of prisoners.
Okay, I'll go ahead and close this out and we'll get to talking here a little bit. So, that video is kind of funny with the cartoons in it, but I like that it sets a little bit of a stage for you for some of the terminology that you're going to hear this afternoon. What is extraordinary about some of the U.S. prison riots is that departments have paid attention. The contemporary departments that we have today have really focused on the lessons that we have learned from some of the riots that were mentioned in this video, Attica, Santa Fe. Some of those great unrest within prison settings taught us, we went back in and reviewed, and it taught us how to establish incredible policy, how to really manage a great big group of people that are standing against their administration. And so I'm proud to say that I as many of you know, worked for quite some time in the Department of Corrections and was a part of the emergency management team. I was a part of some of the hostage negotiations teams and always was impressed by the level of readiness. So I'm incredibly honored to have our guest speaker today because he was the warden at the facility at Colorado State Penitentiary when I went to work there, and was instrumental in the design of one of the most cutting-edge administrative segregation facilities in the world at that time. He was also instrumental in defining our Department of Corrections policy for Colorado in use of force and in emergency management. It is now one of the leading experts in the country on those topics and in the world, right? Does a lot of work globally now, consulting with correctional environments. And so I'm incredibly honored to invite him up to speak about his experiences, some of his experiences in establishing some of those policies and in providing us a really in-depth overview of some of these incidents that we're talking about, or that the video mentioned. So please help me welcome Gina Atherton. Shall I just begin this slideshow for you, Gene?
What's that?
I'll just begin this slideshow for you.
Oh, well, sure. That'll work. Where's my remote? It's around here somewhere.
It's right here.
Okay.
Here you go.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure where to begin this, except that's why I prepared some slides. It sort of helps me out. All this experience of managing disturbances and riots and the use of force in corrections, I had the privilege of kind of being in the middle of the evolution of a lot of that stuff Katie just referred to, and had a lot of oh my God moments. Back when I was a security manager at Buena Vista Correctional Facility in 1980, we had the Santa Fe riot. And 71 was the Attica riot, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And I'm not so sure why the Attica riot didn't really impact me and others as professionals so much as Santa Fe. I think it's because geographically it was very close to us. I don't know, 300 miles south of the Buena Vista Correctional Facility. And the profession began to react immediately. Our warden at the facility was Warren Dieslin, and he came to me as the security manager. He had been off to some conference about riots or something. He came back and he says, Gene, I'm going to blow the whistle here. I'm going to announce an emergency by blowing the whistle at this facility, and we're just going to see what's going to happen. And I know we had no preparation for that whatsoever, so I went really into a panic mode. But he didn't manage to tell him we had no whistle. We couldn't announce an emergency except through the PA system, and we had no system for doing that. So that was the beginning of all that, and from that I was lucky enough to talk to the Department of Corrections and sending me to the Michigan Department of Corrections that at that time had a really good system for responding to emergencies called Siren Drills. And so a big part of my career was developing that system at Buena Vista Siren Drills. And in effect, it means taking a facility of over 40 acres, enclosed in a perimeter, with 300 plus staff and anywhere around 1,000 inmates, and converting it to an organization once the emergency was announced that would react in bed, ready to respond to the emergency in like 25 minutes. Okay, that's about the time it took for us to clear a normal count. But that was the goal that we set for ourselves, that everyone in the facility, everyone, I mean security, programs, administration, food service, everybody would have had our training on our system before we actually tested it. It was a difficult time for me as a young security manager because you ever heard of a day shift commander at a prison? You know, they're pretty prestigious people typically. You know, they have a lot of talent and there's a lot of confidence in the day shift commander, you know, by the overall organization. And that was Billy Bertlow, and he's a Korean War veteran, was a survivor of the Chosin Reservoir Massacre in North Korea. One of the most courageous guys I've ever met in my life, and I really respected him. He was a little uncomfortable with me being his boss, but that's pretty typical as you move through the system. When it came time, we had trained all the staff, trained all the inmates, had written the policy and procedure for siren drills, is what we call them, where we could announce an emergency and everybody in the prison would go into action in terms of a role that they had played, they were destined to play in the emergency. There were new posts and positions, command centers would be set up, there would be alternative ways, inmates would be locked down, the alternative meal services would be created, which is typically sack lunches to the cell. All these arrangements had to be made. The design of the command center, we didn't have a single command center in the state of Colorado in a prison, so that was all brand new. And then we also designed a command center for here in Colorado Springs at headquarters. All of those were innovative kinds of things that really had not been done before, as far as I know, elsewhere in the United States. And it made for a very busy few years. When we came up to the moment to have our first exercise, to mobilize the facility with all this stuff in mind, my dear day shift commander said, "You're going to lose the prison." Me. You're going to lose the prison. Now, just think about that. You got 300 staff, 1,000 inmates, and theoretically, a mission-related training scenario says it's all going to hell. And this stuff proves that it has happened in the past. The problem is, as a public servant, what are you going to do to prevent that from happening in the future? That's the first thing we did when we heard about Santa Fe. The first thing, we heard a couple of things. One was that the inmates just crashed the control room. Control room is a space in the middle of the facility that typically, as much as possible, is electronically controlled to managing outlying areas of the facility in terms of lighting, door control, communications, that sort of thing. And the book says that the vendors who replaced the glass in the master control claimed that it could be pounded for like 3 or 4 hours before it would even crack. And they sent the glazing in for the new glazing for the control center, and they had inmates test it with a hammer, and they broke it to pieces in 30 minutes. So those are the kinds of little details, because during the course of the riot, one of the things that inmates went for is the control room, and they busted the window readily. Staff escaped, and they got in and got the communications, they got all the keys. I think there probably were a few weapons in that area. They literally, and it's a point I want to make, they took over Santa Fe Correctional Facility, Santa Fe State Prison, and anybody guess how much time it took the inmates to take it over? Yes?
30 minutes?
You got it, 30 minutes. This is a huge, complex compound worth hundreds of millions of dollars, And in 30 minutes, the inmates had it completely. It was on graveyard. There was a skeleton staff there, but most of them were drunk, and they had made jack. Nobody picked up on it, and there were a lot of other errors made in terms of how they responded. So I forgot, what was I saying? Help me. What was I just saying? Huh?
The inmates took the facility over in 30 minutes.
Yeah. I'm that sort of stunned us, and it stunned me particularly because I was in charge of a facility that had architecture and engineering very much the same as those facilities. So we were, fortunately we were reformatory before that, and we kind of had a reformatory attitude about being humane with prisoners, and that helped us a lot, I think, because we really never had a major disturbance at any time. So, it's an interesting experience to have lived through. Some of the other facilities started at what they call a lockdown procedure. Is that what it was called out on the prairie? Very, very similar. Upon a signal, everybody locks up, and then you see what the emergency is and go about making changes. Shortly after that, sometime during that time, I came to headquarters for a couple of years, and we developed policy on all those kinds of things. That's when the department was also urging it to become fully compliant with ACA standards in a relatively short period of time. So in that position, I sat on a lot of policy, but certainly all the policy related to safety and security. So then that started at Buena Vista. The interesting things, anyways. Now, emergency plans. Anybody know what those are?
Like a fire drill, it's what you do in case of an emergency.
That can be in the emergency plan, absolutely. Yeah, anything else?
A contingency plan? Contingency plan?
Yeah, hopefully it states what you want staff to do in the face of an emergency, depending on the contingency. Yeah.
Is it like an escape plan?
Well, a lot of them were formatted that way. So you would have a main body of policy, and then you would have specific policy related to escape, to fire, natural disaster, to riots or violent episodes somewhere in the facility. So each of those topics would have its own little plan. What we finally concluded, and I concluded at Buena Vista, is that we couldn't use all that crap. I have to tell you, if you're a shift commander and somebody calls from East Wing or A Block or wherever and says, we have a major fight going on here and it's between the Crips and the Bloods and we're out of control. Okay, you don't have time. Get your 3 volumes of the emergency plan out and do a study about what you think you might want to do. So those plans were started many, many years ago, and I know one friend who was a part of that. He's still consulting today. And they were basically worthless. They were made to show the American public that we had a plan in mind, in case we had those problems. They really didn't benefit the officer on the ground, the person who actually has to do all that stuff. So with that in mind, I wrote 2 plans for the Department of Corrections while I was stationed here at headquarters, 2 editions of the emergency plan. And then the wardens the group of wardens statewide got pissed off, and so they made their own plan, which really highlights what was the problem then. When wardens took it upon themselves to make their own plan and not listen to headquarters, what was the problem?
Headquarters was out of touch. They didn't understand what was actually happening at the facilities.
That could be, but I had just come from those facilities, so I knew what I was talking about. But there was another reason why that was a bad approach. You're on to part of it, yeah, absolutely. And the reason is wardens were not included in the first editions. I had executive staff come to me and say, we need a plan, can you help me? Yeah, sure, because it was in touch with a lot of the stuff nationwide. And so I wrote those plans just to get something done. It wasn't done the right way, because the wardens feel they're close to the action and they're responsible for all that stuff. So they wrote their own plan. It wasn't bad. It was a pretty decent plan. We could have avoided all that and a couple of years of delay by listening to them in the first place. So, the command I wrote under the other category are the others, and that's what I wrote for Colorado repeatedly over a period of years. And then Jeff Schwartz came along with LETRA Enterprise. Anybody heard of that for emergency plan training, LETRA? It's based out of California, and Jeff is a friend of mine, and he did emergency management training for several states, particularly in the Northwest, and many of them today are still operating under the LETRA system. And what he would do is the Jeff Schwartzian version of how staff should conduct themselves in emergency, put a ribbon on it, copyrighted it, and in his initial contracts from different states, he would mobilize large groups of students from different state corrections agency, take them to California and give them the Jeff Schwartz education. Staff are absolutely dedicated to that training, and it was hugely expensive. You know, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars per state, maybe more than that. So along came Incident Command, and it took the place of all that. Today we have probably about 60% of all facilities, prisons and jails are under the Incident Command system, and more every day are shifting over to the Incident Command system. It is provided by FEMA, the federal agency. You all heard of that in terms of hurricanes and natural disasters. But FEMA also did an operational structure, I guess you call it, or a template for how to respond to emergencies that applied to all emergency responders. And the principles of it fit perfectly over managing emergencies and corrections. So immediately got attention, and a couple of friends of mine were the first in Arizona to convert their system to Incident Command and begin training to it. And basically what it does, it avoids all those giant volumes of reference materials, although they're good to have if you have a prolonged emergency and need to know important specific information. The rest of it focused on the person who discovered the emergency, and according to Incident Command, it makes that person, for that period of time, the commander of the incident. That has huge implications for how it unfolds, because typically we're still in a sort of a fashion for having subordinate and superior relationships, unfortunately. It still continues, it's a big tradition. Well, Incident Command involves more ground staff, involves more people in the daily operation of the facilities, in the execution of the plan, which I think is part of its magic. Another part of its magic, it's free. It's produced by FEMA from the federal government, and you all can take the courses and sign up and certify. I did that a couple of years ago, and they're well designed and it's easy to understand, especially since I've already done some of those emergency plans. So we still have a mixture. It's very clear that at Attica and in Santa Fe, nobody had any emergency plan. They had what they called an emergency plan, but it's still what I just described to you as having existed nationwide previously in just a bunch of volumes that really don't have any purpose in the real life of responding to an emergency. Okay? Any questions about that? Hello, good morning. I wanted to say, and I don't think I put this in my slides, but one observation I made, it's been a long time since I reviewed this material, but there were no intelligence officers at each place that had representatives in the facilities. Now, Attica may have, but definitely Santa Fe did not. They hired a person to be in charge of intelligence. You know, that's gathering information from the facilities on the inmates and then processing it so it might be usable information, and that's called intelligence. And nobody was doing it in New Mexico. So you don't have intelligence services, and you have problems like lack of communications. You can imagine, these things are going down in a matter of hours, in a few days, that in Attica, all they had was a telephone. Okay, now, I was working in prison when radios found their way into prison, handheld fax sets, and it was interesting because that was right not too far after Santa Fe, and everybody was frightened to death. The people who never had a radio before in their career now were demanding one, and they're at about $1,200 a pop. It was really a hard budget to develop and get approved. So I think we bought a few radios every year, but everyone had to have one. And so we've been through that, and you know that has. Shoot, I'm sorry, I'm losing my place here. Oh, intelligence. Without the radio, without intelligence officers gathering information about who we have, and just having general notions of who the bad guys are and who the good people are, it makes it really hard to manage the emergency in those days. Another thing with respect to intelligence, and it really came out in Santa Fe, is they had, when I heard that at Buena Vista, we all kind of, our jaws dropped when we heard it. The warden, and the director, Rodriguez, Felix, I think Rodriguez, said at Santa Fe, we're very proud to announce that at least half the prisoners that I own, personally I own at least half the prisoners. What was he talking about? Anybody know? I own half the prisoners. We heard that and we went into shock. Under the same circumstances, we would maybe have 3 or 4 prisoners at Buena Vista out of 1,000. And he said out of 1,200 in Santa Fe, we own, I think the title was, the label was we own 500 of them.
They're lifers, they're never getting out.
Nope.
They followed them?
They what?
The prisoners kind of were respectful to the warden, or it was that he had dirt on them?
There you go. That he was using the snitch system to the point of destruction of human relationships in the prison. Half the prison were snitches, and half the prison were inmates who had been snitched upon, who would do anything to have the opportunity to kill the snitches. That was the beginning of the disturbance there, with a whole lot of problems. It's amazing to me that more weren't killed.
So because they gained access to the control center, they were able to access the protected population there?
I'm not certain of that, because the problem, and I'll get into it with physical plant, the problem with responding to management, and my purpose in here is to talk about things that didn't exist then that we have today that are very important, and I'll end with a paragraph that I think brings it all together. But during those days, no. And the problem is, and it's the problem at Attica and it's a problem at Santa Fe, is no one had keyless operations at all. Got it? So that 30 minute time frame, or that 1 hour time frame, part of the reason those prisons were captured by the inmates is officers had the keys to every critical barrier on their belt. And from the minute I got into the business, I looked at that and said, that's not going to work, because all we need to do is take that person, take those keys, and we got what we want if we're going to do a riot or capture the facility. I mean, it's amazing to behold, but there was a big trend during that time, and I was involved in designing of facilities here for Colorado and advising elsewhere, and keyless was the only way we did things. Now, the feds over at FBOP have an interesting variation of that. They have remote operating doors from a control point at each housing unit, protected control point, and another one at master control that can take over each of the slave systems. And they still carry the keys on their belt. I've never been able to explain that to myself, or nobody in the federal system has, but they have a big wad of keys on their belt with like a silver chain attached to their belt. I guess the idea in mind is if their keys, somebody's going to take their keys, they have to take their belt as well. I don't see the issue there. It's still a problem. So, the Fed, and I think that's throughout building facilities and designing programs for facilities, including responding to riots. You have a culture to deal with. And part of there was somebody in the federal system who built all the previous facilities and said, I want a keychain on all the belts, and got it. That's just how things go. So. The big part, after we started the mobilization drills, Siren Drills at Buena Vista, which became the practice in the state, and I think holds a lot of the keys to keeping prisons safe, even though you're going to have a riot or disturbance, is how you train staff. We had, at the time, I can't remember the exact numbers, but we had, we had somewhere around 1,000 inmates. I think it was more like 700 in about 250 staff, something like that. And the design, like I say, was very similar to these two facilities. And after we decided what we wanted to do, and we developed the lesson plans, and we developed the policy that goes with it, it was approved by everybody. We had to test it. So we got it together. I don't know exactly how we got all this done, but we trained all the staff in a few weeks, and we did an orientation program for every inmate in the facility. That was a big chunk. The more we trained with this, and I relied heavily on shift commanders, captains, to lead the training, and like I say, one of them said I was going to blow up the facility, and he was serious. Another one said Bill Nelson was a swing shift commander, former Navy guy, and he says, oh yeah, I know what this is all about. It's like, you ever hear that sound when destroyers at sea go to war? They have a all hands on deck sound that mobilizes everybody. Everybody gets out of their bunk, runs to their guns, whatever they do. This is the same concept. The more we trained, the more acceptance we seemed to get from everybody. I think inmates realized we weren't trying to do anything to harm them. We wanted to do have things in place, because with most disturbances, it's seldom that a majority of the inmates are involved. It's usually less than a majority. And typically the real ringleaders, they're advocating violence and developing weapons and that kind of stuff, are, I think, in Santa Fe that may have been 50, and in Attica that was 30 inmates that were regarded as ringleaders, those that advocated violence in the takeover of prisons because of inhumane treatment. So we did massive amount of training, and I had the great privilege of working with the Office of Emergency Management in Colorado, and having them teach me how they do training for emergencies in communities. How do they mobilize communities? And they were very helpful, and we adopted those formats to our emergency management training in Colorado, and they were a great help. So we learned from them tabletop training and the whole concept of mobilizing an organization to respond to emergencies. So at that point, we were doing things in corrections that people had not heard of. We were inviting all the emergency responders in Chaffee County to come to the prison and position themselves as though they were going to respond to an emergency. So when I walked into the facility, I remember we were running an exercise, and there was like 35 emergency vehicles, ambulances, all over the place, coming from around the county. And we did another exercise that actually led them in the perimeter, and we had them exercise putting a ladder up to the 3rd tier of one of our cell blocks. So they started to get some confidence actually coming into the prison, and that was very helpful. So were the emergency management services in the state. And a big deal is the second to the last one, is mobilizing staff. None of what I just described could be done by me alone at all, nor did I have the administrative staff to support what I was doing. So I had to come up with an idea about how we might make this work. So we started an emergency management committee at the facility, and we did not reserve it just for people in blue shirts. We wanted anybody and everybody to come from their job if they wanted to help out. And that was a big deal with this stuff, because I didn't have to persuade anybody that this was important. It's easy sell. You know, emergency management, safety, oh yeah, everybody was up for that, especially after these disturbances. So then during that time, we also realized we need tactical teams. So we really got serious about crowd control and in dispersing major emergencies and having that capability, as well as a lethal force team, which we supplied with weapons, and we had training and practice for those people. Incidentally, all of them, at the time I left, all of them were all volunteers. There was nobody paid to do that role, but they all thought it was important enough to participate. And by the time we got done, then we got tapped by the department to work on tactical team training policy for the department, for every facility. And yeah, it was really a great time. I think we really gave ourselves confidence that we could respond to emergency pretty quickly and successfully. Physical plan. Any questions about what I just said? A lot of stuff going on in corrections, right? Yeah. It's not simple. It's almost never simple. Both, as I mentioned, both Attica and Santa Fe were very antiquated compared to contemporary designs. That's a fact of the matter, because I was involved in the designs of all the new facilities, I think all the new facilities, and the modification of existing facilities during 5 or 6 years in Colorado. And there's no question and that's the whole point of this. There are tons of things that you get into corrections today, you will find that are work obligations that were created by the systems promoted to stop Attica and Santa Fe from ever happening again. Yes, Kate?
I have a question here. So this is about, got early 90s here that we're talking about, right?
No,
Mid
80s.
Oh, okay, late 80s.
Yeah.
And I know during that time there was a lot of construction in Colorado prisons, like Lyman, Arkansas Valley, some of those. And so, did you observe some significant changes to the accepted prison designs in the wake of some of these incidents? Do you think it was impactful to the prison designs that went in across the country?
Oh, there's
The
no question
architectural
about
design.
it. You know, architects and engineers and people like myself representing agencies had Santa Fe in mind each design decision. And so originally the old style was committed to isolating critical events without harming the rest of the facility. It never worked. So the new designs are an attempt to make that happen. And a big part of that is how the doors are controlled in the facility. If they're remotely controlled through electronics, you can have an alarm, and the first thing that person does is push the button to close all the gates, isolating the living units, or the yard and work areas that produce a lot of contraband as a beginning to managing the emergency. Yeah, and that's a big one. And then nobody carries keys. I mean, unless it's an emergency. They have a whole bank of emergency keys. Nobody carries them, so they're not exposed to inmates. That was a huge improvement. As far as the layout is concerned, the profession has really wanted small cell blocks because they're easier, more humane to manage in people's view. From a practitioner's point of view, I think that's probably true. Because you see some of the old cell blocks, especially at Santa Fe or at Attica or in California, are the old 3 and 4. I think I saw one 5-tier cell block, and they're really not a nice place to live. You know, I mean, that's the only way I can put it. And a lot of taxpayers don't really care if it's not a nice place to live, but it's not a healthy environment, you know. So the high-risk work environments is a big deal. So Santa Fe or Attica put all their metalworking shops, all their industrial shops inside the perimeter. And they had a blockage, a traffic control point managing traffic to and from work to the main cell blocks. But really what that means is those, and their weapon production areas is what those things are leading up to a disturbance. They're not properly isolated from the rest of the prison. So it's easy for the prisons. If you can take a prison over in 60 minutes, you can get to those shops and get your weapons made and get a hold of the acetylene torches to cut through bars and to kill people, you know. So what was your question?
I was just wondering about, like, for example, like just as you're talking, Attica was a great big square perimeter?
Huge.
Essentially, yeah. And then, so these dangerous environments were inside the great big square. So if they
Yes.
took over the great big square, then the accessible weapons were inside of that hard perimeter?
And the weapons is almost the unusual exception. Usually they cram the weapons in the base of a tower or something like that outside the perimeter, but everything else is inside. And inmates never got a hold of weapons, normal, traditional weapons in Attica.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a big deal, and I went at a couple of our facilities. You'll notice that we have warehouses and we have storage spaces and warehouses and power plants outside of the facility perimeter. And I think there's no other way to responsibly build a prison other than that, or a jail. Yeah, the design and that's why I like the design work so much. I just did it as part of my job, but the effects of the design can affect you people if you're working at a prison in your career for 50 years. I mean, some of this work we did can last for 50 years before it has to be replaced. So that was the big flaw, and that would never design a prison that way in the future. What I meant to talk about is conditions of confinement generally. And as I reviewed this material, I got kind of confused because the conditions at Attica and Santa Fe were not that much different than what I had at Buena Vista, and I managed those conditions. So what the media tries to do, and that is the media writing a lot of this stuff, well, it is entirely the media, either journalists or people representing news services, is to portray everything in the prisons as the worst possible condition. And like monitoring the mails, or simple things that we've known to accept as standard procedures. That's primarily to intercept drugs and escape attempts by monitoring, and in part by intercepting mailings that advocate violence and disruption in the facility. That's a big deal now, and that it wasn't a big deal a long time ago. I mean, inmates just got mail, but they're getting smart. Criminals are getting smarter, and there are various ways to get drugs in the facility, and mail is one of them. But what they meaning the authors of this book, and by the way, let me mention that whenever you have a major event in your profession, like for us, corrections, Attica and Santa Fe, about 12 or 13 people write books about it. I spent quite a bit of time going to people I know. My good friend was the warden of Santa Fe prison after it was rebuilt, so he was there with a lot of people that were there during this disturbance. And I can't remember where I got the reference from in New York, but they said that the New York Commission on Attica, their publication was absolutely the best on that facility. And I just finished reading it for enough time in it. You're getting into corrections, and you want really a solid sort of insight to how people make decisions at all levels and respond to emergencies and that kind of stuff. This is really well worth looking at. But you have to remember, it's all written by Supreme Court judges, state Supreme Court judges, federal judges, people of high positions from law firms and physicians for medical treatment, all that kind of stuff. They kind of, they're a little bit different, in how they see things and interpret things, and they're very susceptible to inmate suggestions about how things really are, according to the inmates. So I highly recommend this book. Anyways, I got the 2 books, and they are very comprehensive, and I have the references for those books if anybody's interested in a form of a handout. I mean, if you're going to get involved in corrections, you should be very concerned about safety all the time. I'm a safety nut. I admit it. I lost a family member by a stupid mistake early in my life, and maybe that got me started, but safety to me is everything. If you can't get it and feel comfortable about it, you shouldn't be there. So the general conditions, the observation I had about Santa Fe, it was horrible. Santa Fe was really bad compared to other prisons around the nation, but today, New Mexico is a Golden Eagle state, I think, for ACA corrections, and I've done some audits down there. Complete turnaround. I mean, the culture's still there. And my good friend who was the warden there said there's a culture of fear in that state like he's never experienced anyplace else. He doesn't know how to describe it, but it's there all the time. Yes, Kate?
What's interesting to me about the wake of these, the major incidents in the United States, Attica, Santa Fe, is that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, in the wake of that, there was a lot of significant lawsuits, Ramos, Ruiz, Plata in California, things like that were focused on conditions of confinement. So my question for you is, when you were an administrator during that time, how impactful was the outcomes of those cases to the translation of emergency management policy?
Almost zero. Because when people at that level make they advertise standardized practices, they tend to be very, very general. What I'm sharing with you guys today would never be considered by people at that level making a policy. So they'll say it very generally, and I would just summarize probably what ACA standards does is says you will have an emergency plan. They don't tell you what kind of plan they have and how it's supposed to function in reality. They just say you will have if you have one and it's been updated and properly reviewed and there's some documentation it's actually followed, you're done. That's it. So the lawsuits, I'm not so sure affected that, but I'll give you a good example of what the lawsuits do affect. Is that Attica, the inmates had maybe 20 or 30 grievances, one of which was the rule that said that an inmate had to not speak if that inmate was ordered to be quiet. And officers would walk in with the billy club, and there might be 50 people in the cell block, and he'd order them all not to speak. And otherwise, that officer could take them out and run them to segregation. Now, I've been there and done that. I have a hard time understanding the circumstances that would support that rule. Okay? I mean, any of you, if I told you, it's great that you're a student here, but as long as you don't speak, you know, it'll be all right. You know, so there are rules like that. They were at Attica and at Santa Fe that were really antiquated, really not sensible. It was more the birth of an ancient culture that had some remnants left in prison practices. So there was a lot of that kind of stuff. And I really should add that, especially in New York, that the Commissioner of Corrections and the director were well on their way to, I think there were 28 important points in the inmates' demand, and they probably had maybe 20 or 22 already in progress before they even knew they were going to have a riot, that they were changing and modifying things to meet those demands. You know, so what you had is parallel things going on. Corrections, especially in old facilities, were being renovated and being told that they had to meet contemporary standards, you know, and they were on their way. And then the inmate just said, "We've had enough. It's time to riot." You know, it doesn't make much sense to me, but it sort of does if you think of it globally. You know, it kind of makes sense. So, conditions of confinement really bad at Santa Fe. Sort of like we had at Buena Vista, but we were a lot nicer and more humane with our inmates than they were at Attica. They did mention in the book that almost all the security people were from northern New York, and they were country people, okay? Mostly white country people that came to work at Santa Fe, and not most, but majority of the prisoners at Attica, majority of prisoners came out of New York City, Buffalo, major metropolitan areas, and they didn't know anything about what was outside their world. So they both showed up at Attica, and the inmates were going through the, civil rights movement. Bobby Seale visited the facility from the Black Panthers. There were a lot of so-called observers of that sort there then. I don't think probably were not a good idea, but an effort to talk to inmates. So, yeah, very interesting time. Questions?
So would you say that, comparing these two big incidents, that Santa Fe was a example of an event that was triggered by violence, where Attica was more focused on change to conditions of confinement?
Well, the Santa Fe inmates really wanted things to be better and different, but they didn't know how to go about it. And they just basically, with the snitch, non-snitch system in the population, it's difficult, you know, you future researchers, you need to get out there and find out what, how much does that affect the sociology of the prison population by having a well-practiced, dominant snitch system. I would suggest, as a professional, that it would be horrible. The effect would be horrible. You have large groups of inmates who actually absolutely hate each other because they've been snitched on, or they've been a snitch, and they, and with a lot of them, the ultimate result is death. So, that has to have a huge, probably a lot of people are not cooperating and not doing what they could be doing to make it a good facility.
Do you think there is any benefit to having protective custody at some level? That's $1 million question, right?
Yeah, it's we could spend another day on protective custody. Our obligation is to protect, and if someone is at risk and says, "I think somebody's going to kill me," you need to do something about it. You need to do something about it. As a correctional officer, working in a system that has a policy about PC inmates and that sort of thing. But it really is, I don't know what the word is, it's hard to define, because when I was at Buena Vista, I was in charge of housing. I was a security manager at that time, and George Sullivan was here in charge, and he ordered us to take all the protective custody inmates, all of them, from the state, and at that time there were like 30, transfer them to Buena Vista, and then counsel and persuade them into going back into general population, even if they think there was a risk involved.
And George Sullivan actually came from Santa Fe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it says, don't let inmates abuse the protective custody system, and use your own judgment about when someone needs to be protected. But he said the vast majority of them, we got 30 in one day, and within 2 months, they were all back in general population doing just fine. Okay, so that gives you some perspective on an inmate who says, I'm in danger, you need to protect me. Some of them might be doing that because they just want out of the general population because they have bad gambling debts, bad drug debts, or they're a kind of person that just doesn't get along with others. All of those candidates come forward, and it's correctional staff have to sort through that to come up with a good decision. It's not easy.
So I have a question about, then you talk about inmates and their conditions with their confinement. What about the staff and their conditions? Do you believe in making the staff more happy than the inmates, or vice versa?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that anybody makes another person more happy. That just doesn't happen, in my opinion.
Okay.
It is. I remember when we first started 7 Habits on the Inside in Colorado. Basically, it was started as an inmate program, and Jerry Gasco was initiated that in a big way. And I remember he had a story when he first came to the Canyon City area, when he first came to Colorado, and the staff approached him and said, very aggressively, he says, whose side are you on? Them or us? Yeah, I want to hear it now. How would you respond to that? Anybody? Whose side are you on? Them or us? And Jerry said, I'm not on either side. I do what is right for the Department of Corrections, and that's it. And those guys just backed off. They said, okay, yeah. And that proved to be true because Jerry wouldn't hesitate to separate somebody from service who's a bad apple and is doing some crazy unprofessional stuff. He wouldn't hesitate at all. And neither would I, for that matter, because we represented the best interest of the system. And we couldn't help people that wouldn't be helped. Yeah? Did I answer the question?
To a degree, I was more aiming towards, like, does it increase productivity? That's what I'm more like aiming towards.
Oh, great question. When we started 7 Habits, officers in the prison were watching the change in inmate behavior. And Katie's done a lot of her work on that, and it was especially even to the older, more experienced officers, the 10 or 20-year veterans. They were saying, "I don't know what you're doing with these inmates, but it's incredible." Well, I remember we had a class at Fremont Correctional Facility, and one of the shift commanders I talked about, the ancient, tried and true, warriors of their time, came into our class, just walked in on his last day before retirement. He got behind the podium. He says, "I don't know what you guys are doing, but this is incredible." He says, "I have never seen anything like this in terms of a behavior change as a result of a program in corrections in my life." He said, "Whatever you do, please don't stop." That was the message from tried and true traditional kinds of things. But during those periods, what we began to do is open up, and what officers said is, "I want that stuff. For whatever reason, I don't get along with other people very well. I have problems at home, or I'm just not as effective as I want to be on the job." They wanted 7 Habits for themselves, and so they now have it in several facilities for officers. Franklin Covey, or Dr. Covey, not Franklin Covey, Dr. Covey, Stephen Covey, said, I was at a lecture here in Colorado with him, and he says, I think probably if you just practices all the principles of this human behavior stuff and human relationships, there'd be no problems between staff and inmates. And I was in the audience, and I hadn't really talked to him personally yet, and I kicked back and I thought, you gotta be crazy. You know, I mean, I was probably halfway through my career, but I knew other people who've been around much longer, and we had good relationships, but I refused to accept the idea that the relationship between staff and inmates could be substantially changed by different behavior. And after another year of teaching it and understanding it more thoroughly, I truly believe that's possible. You know, the whole idea with that one program is, what can we do to empty bunks? Send people home to their families, their communities, and be more productive citizens and not a burden to anyone, and not hurt anybody. So, yeah, that was a great time. And so some things have gone that way. And I don't know all the other benefits that human relations would offer for officers. And I'm also on the board of directors for the Desert Waters program, which is a private program that offers counseling and survival skill training to correctional officers, which is a real big deal too, in my mind. And it's not funded by the state.
Thank you.
What was the buy-in, Jean? Like, your career is interesting to me because your young career, you're in that really hard old school culture, and then these things happen. Attica happens, Santa Fe happens, right? These lawsuits hit, civil rights happens, and then you find yourself in administration, right? You're going up into executive levels. Did you find that administration, executive, legislature was more accepting of this emergency management process because of that?
Yeah, they all wanted it not to happen, for sure. And when I did proposals based on Santa Fe and Attica and these other places, I collected all the after-action reports I could possibly collect from Atlanta, Oakdale, Talladega, the other riot in upstate New York, Montana State Prison riot. I collected everything I could get, but ultimately over the years, the Department of Corrections got wise to that, and they stopped releasing their reports to citizens. But I had enough, I guess. I had several years of collecting, and then I would take that and formulate it into a proposal, and then become, as best I could, effective presenter for those needs, to make our prison as safe as it could possibly be, given the circumstances. We weren't going to knock it down and rebuild it. That was out. But we had a lot of proposals that went forward, incidentally, about the same time that we heard we were going to double bunk across the state, which is a huge operational crisis for some. But we did it really well. And I got both. I got the attention of leadership because they didn't want this stuff to happen. And I seemed to be, at a point, I was kind of speaking by myself about what we should do next. I was the one that approached Director Southers and said, we do all kinds of other stuff in the Department of Corrections, for programs, for vocations, for construction and engineering and all this kind of stuff. But we don't have we don't have a department that supports and develops issues of safety. We don't have it. So I said, how would you like, Mr. Southers, for if we had a major disturbance, what you would tell the journalists, for that matter, or anybody, why we didn't have our resources focused in that direction. And then for about 4 or 5 years after that, we had an organization that included SORT, ERTs, security audits, and a bunch of centralized functions in the department to help rearrange our resources to go out to the prisons, find out what's going on, and use those findings as a part of performance expectations. And it worked. It worked really well. But after a while, other departments going, well, that department has 8 people, we only have 6, we sure could use another one. And eventually that whole thing kind of melted away after about 5 years, because leadership got distracted by other things. Did I answer your question?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble tracking this morning, I apologize. Conditions confinement, yeah. Security systems failures, this is only the beginning of a small amount of things. The failure at Central Times Square gate control. It's just another example of gate control failure, and it failed at Santa Fe, it failed at Attica. Central Times Square gate control is a central hub that has walkways, they call tunnels, but they're actually above ground, that go out to each cell block. And then from that, I'm assuming, I couldn't find it in the book, that Times Square central control controlled access to each cell block, and there could be as many as 300 to 400 inmates behind that grill. And that's part of their control system. What happened is a bunch of inmates just slammed up against the grill and it broke. And so at that point, they all spilled out into D yard, I believe, and continued to do that. Oh, and got into Times Square, smashed the windows and assaulted the officers and released the other cell blocks to also go to D yard. And there were over 1,100 inmates, about 11 or 1,200 involved in the riot. The remaining inmates out of the 2,200 did not participate. Or, yeah, they just didn't get involved, tried to protect themselves, which is normal. So, communication systems, I mean, when I heard, I was reminded once again that all they had were telephones at Attica. That, you know, in the 70s and 80s was when all this technology grew up, applied to corrections. Very sophisticated radio systems that had what we call talk groups, which were isolated, dedicated groups of people who could communicate amongst each other but be protected from any other people listening or coming into the circle. And you could design that for your whole prison. So one might be tactical teams, another one might be the emergent ERT teams, another might be the command staff that are operating the command center that didn't really exist at Santa Fe. But if it did, you know, the number one communication would have been on the radio between the commander and all the teams that are out in the facilities making things happen. They didn't have that. Either they couldn't communicate at all, or they, after several attempts and consuming a lot of time, they finally get through to somebody, because the telephone just doesn't make it for a modern contemporary facility.
It's interesting to me, this topic area, because you think that in contemporary corrections that these things facilities are protected by these really advanced security technology procedures. But what you're talking about here is key control, tool control, radio communication, fence locks. It's really just the most basic security practices.
Well, it is. And technology certainly has, I'll get into it in a second, it's really advanced. But when we do after actions behind all these negative experiences, it usually boils down to that. Staff take shortcuts in procedures or do not follow procedures at all. And that is routinely discovered across the nation. Yeah. Contraband control, absolute disaster. I mean, after hearing about Attica and then reading about everything that was involved in Santa Fe, Attica and Santa Fe were both equally as bad. Acetylene torches. I don't know, does anybody know him, has ever used one of those acetylene torches? You can cut through anything with it. You can cut through bars and stainless steel, whatever. And they were just able to go into the metal shops and grab the torches and bring them in, and then make their pathways through the prison as they wish to do. That both at Santa Fe, or both at Attica, and for sure at Santa Fe, they're using acetylene torches to kill inmates. They're actually just blowing up their heads with a torch. Sorry, don't mean to get too graphic there, but contraband control, that's where it all comes from. If you have keys, weapons, and you have keys, weapons, what else? They make bombs from pipes. There are just all kinds of things that can be done, and they were able to do that at Attica, and that really impacted the assault to take the prison back, because the impression was the inmates that were protecting the hostages were ready to go to war, and they had everything they could possibly put together to hurt correctional officers. Use of force. Santa Fe basically happened at the time, 1980, and I was there then. We were far more advanced on use of force than they were. They really had no policy to speak of, and their training didn't really prepare staff for any aspect of the emergency. They had no command center. There was consistently a problem with who was in charge in order to get a decision made. Corrections in a major facility is difficult enough as it is to process decisions from day to day, but put it in a riot condition, the people very often just don't know what to do, and they can go into a shock sort of state where they don't do anything. Yeah, no training on use of force.
Gina, at Santa Fe, did they have a emergency team that was made up of correction staff for that entry, or did they have external resources like police, state patrol, things like that?
The state patrol came in
Santa Fe?
and assisted on the perimeter, but as far as I can tell, there were no emergency response teams, no weapons teams, nothing organized to respond to the riot internally, including policy. And it was just stunning, because with those set of circumstances, then those guys have set up that whole facility is just a victim of itself. Who we got here? Good dog. Can you sit? Oh my gosh, look at that. Better than mine. No training. So what are you going to do? I mean, that was the nightmare I had up at Buena Vista, is that happens to us, and we can't say that we were prepared. So we did tons of stuff. I mean, our armory was in the basement at Buena Vista underneath the control center, but it was not well protected by the physical structure. So we moved it out of the facility into a vacant building, and we made an armory out there. We did a lot of adjustments. We turned the conference room in the administrative area into a command operation, something we could convert to a command center really easily. And a lot of other facilities followed suit, because that's an easy adjustment. You put all your emergency manuals and all your material and everything in file cabinets, and then if you want to make it a command center, you just pull everything out and go to work. It worked really well.
That was really interesting to me too about these two. A lesson that came forward as a result of these two incidents is the benefit to having emergency responders that have a perspective of the facility, for example, as opposed to having somebody from the National Guard respond inside of a correctional environment, as opposed to somebody who is a volunteer officer who is on a SORT team, who knows corrections and who knows offender populations, and even the layout of the facility, as you say, where the weapons are located in the facility, and how efficient that can be.
Can be really efficient, yeah, absolutely. They had no system in Attica for dispersing weapons to officers.
Right.
Nothing. They had no records. It was terrible. We'll always make mistakes in corrections, but we can't suggest that we can be excused for not doing anything. That when other places have done stuff, and no one in command. Yeah, state police. I remember I saw them in college in Michigan. When I was a freshman, I wasn't participating, but we had the largest panty raid in the history of the university.
Wow.
My freshman year, the first month I was there, and it was such a huge university. I mean, a big panty raid was like a 1,100 people, guys, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, stupid guys that are just screaming and hollering. They really get your attention. So they called out the state patrol, and they were all lined up, remember, along the avenue with their axe handles and their helmets. That's all they know how to do, and is disperse civil disturbances. And it's usually flat ground where they can't advantage, closer quarters, and that's all they know how to do. And that's all they knew how to do when they went to Santa Fe. And their instructions, and this goes along with the fact that there was no one person in command during the Santa Fe emergency, the Attica emergency, and I can't tell you how crippling that is. Because then you have 4 or 5 people who really may not have an answer, but you spend the next couple hours going to each person and finding out they don't know, they don't have an answer for you. It's terrible not having one commander. So their commander, the state patrol was designated by Governor Rockefeller to go in and take back the prison. Their commander said, yeah, we taught you use of force, use lethal force on bad guys and not on good people. And, it's a very generic use of force program. And which meant that each individual state patrol guy, I can't remember how many there were, but there were a lot, were in positions to fire down on the yard where the inmates were holding the hostages captive in the middle of the yard. And they were told to use their own judgment. Well, these are the guys out of the North Country that have never interacted with anybody from the city and are subject to all the mythology and bullshit about the reality of that. And then the Black Panthers and those groups, they never liked correctional officers in the first place. They absolutely hated them. And the one exception would be the black Muslims. And they were incredible. They really saved a lot of lives in the riot, and they were not involved. They said right up front, we're committed to keeping people safe. And they actually jeopardized their own lives at time to do that. I'm sorry, I get rambling here, and then I forget the original
It really
question.
demonstrates the dynamic of the situation. Just the culture groups that you're referencing.
Huge dynamic.
The lack of perspective in the responders, that entire collective dynamic that is present. And at Attica, they fill the entire facility with tear gas. So there is also the dynamic introduced into the riot. So when they make that entry, how dangerous that actually is, those moments.
Some of the most dangerous moments I could think of. Here you have a whole army of officers with high-powered rifles and shotguns with double-aught buck.
Right.
And they could prove that they were firing at distances of 50 yards or greater, which means the double-aught buck has, I don't know how many balls are in that load, but that's like a 38 round, each individual load. And at 50 yards, it would spread almost the pattern as wide as this room. So if that's the only weapon, and that person is authorized to use it, if he or she feels that they're going to be overrun by inmates, or the inmates are threatening enough and they shoot at them, they're not going to hit just one, they're likely to seriously injure others as well. And some testimony before the Warren Commission said they had witnesses that said, we watched the state patrol go into the yard, and the hostages were forced to dig a ditch around the middle of the outside edge of the D yard, and they were walking along the ditch, and they were hiding in the ditch, and you was just firing on them and firing into the tents. And the most gripping thing that I heard in that book is the issue of what happened to the hostages, and did we save any? There were 11 hostages, and they were all killed. There were 11 people, they were all killed. There were, I think, 10 hostages. 9 hostages out of the 11. And those hostages, those were our people, our correctional officers, our citizens in the community, that were all killed by the state patrol. I got kind of a wind of that many years ago, and I thought, my God, that really renews your commitment to use of force training, and And nobody in command told the people at Attica that retribution, after we capture the facility, retribution towards inmates will be strictly prohibited. No one did that. Nobody in command talked to the troops and said, you have lots of force and ability here, you have your baton and you're not, after it's all over with, you gotta change hats and stay all the way professional throughout the closure of the disturbance, and no one did that. So there's evidence that inmates were put through what do we call that, a gauntlet, with riot batons, and were struck and beat, by the officers, and unkind things were said to them and so forth. Yeah, it was pretty nasty. The problem is, I know of at least 2 other major riots during that time in which that was done. Montana State Prison and Camp Hill. And a good friend of mine, Jeff Schwartz, was at Camp Hill. He watched it. As the inmates came off the bus to come from one facility to another, they put them through a gauntlet, and they were actually, Jeff says, they were actually ramming the riot baton in the anus of the inmates who were naked going through that deal. Yeah. And I met one guy that was involved in the Montana State Prison riot as an officer, and he and I met in Afghanistan. I mentioned that I read the report and all that, and he wouldn't talk to me any time after that while we were in Afghanistan. He was there, and either was quit or fired immediately after that. No one in command, state police not properly trained, and the wrong weapons. At a time when we had less lethal weapons technology beginning to emerge, they did use tear gas. They dumped it from a helicopter, a giant bucket from the helicopter initially into DR, and it was CN and CS gas. In my my information is CN and CS gas. One of the two, and I can't remember which one it is really highly dangerous. Yeah, is it CS? Mm-hmm. In confined spaces, you can kill people, and that's all they had. And they didn't have any of the less lethal technology. But yet, on their side, you have to keep in mind, they're going into a prison where over 1,000 inmates are rioting, have destroyed things, have done all kinds of bad things, and in the middle of that are 38 people. Is it 38? No, I can't remember the total number of hostages. In the middle of that are hostages. They're guarded by the black Muslims. They're guarded from other inmates by the black Muslims in the center of the yard, and they're in tents in enclosures to protect them from the weather and that kind of stuff. And these guys are going in thinking they're going to be fired upon. They're going to be attacked by the inmates with swords and knives and all that kind of stuff. So they're pretty fired up. They want to get their people out of there unharmed. Unfortunately, it didn't work at all. It was terrible. And that really affected that state. A good friend of mine, after that, a good friend of mine was in New York State, was in charge of classification and emergency response for the state of New York. And I'll never forget, he sent me a lot of materials as I was developing stuff here, and he described to me that their new policy was, if any of their prisons have a riot, they take staff from their central office unit who are prepared, and they wholesale replace the warden and the deputy wardens of that facility and manage the disturbance until it's over. I looked at him and I said, I don't know how you can justify that, but that's New York. I mean, they're in the top 5 or 6 in terms of total population. They're big systems. So, I don't want to make any judgments, because Rich was very nice to help me out here in Colorado, and I just never heard of that idea. I don't think it's being practiced elsewhere. Very expensive and questionable. Okay.
evolution of technology, I mean, it's everywhere. I worked for 4 years for the Department of Justice as technology guy for prisons, and I tell you, there's just armies of vendors out there hoping they'll just invent that magic thing that makes all prison problems go away, and of course, a lot of them fail. But it is amazing how much of it there is for jails and prisons. Chemicals, like I said, are different now. Cameras and body cameras, they're the only thing that was filmed at Attica was a few videos from the press. There were black and white photos, and that was it. Now we have camera systems throughout the United States. The biggest problem is when they go down, they're not repaired or maintained, and then you have somebody get hurt, and they will say that it was your responsibility to keep that camera going, and if you had done that, I wouldn't have been hurt. That's a lawsuit, and I've participated in a few, and they're not fun. Because basically the level of questioning in these lawsuits is getting down to correctional officer Jones or Smith on a particular day decided to put this inmate A in restraints. He got disruptive and he hurt the officer, and he shouldn't have been in that cell block, so we're going to sue the classification committee of that prison for that event. A lot of that is happening throughout the United States, and it bothers me a whole lot, about what that can do to our profession. I guess one other way of putting it is having a monitor on your shoulder every time you make a basic decision in the cell block. And if the inmate is not happy and he can make a case of violation of a constitutional right, it's very likely it's going to happen.
This was incredibly impactful to me in my early career in corrections, the weapon systems and the advancement of weapon systems, because I began to recognize when I was pretty young as an officer, and you brought in the OC, right? The ISPRA projectile jet, things like that, into high custody. And so the OC, guys, is kind of an organic substance, right? But we were using it on a daily basis, right? For forced cell entry, for low lethal scenarios. And what was important about that is that offenders got used to seeing it. They were getting exposed to that on a regular basis, so they knew that it was present in the facility and that we would likely use it. They knew how much it sucked, and they knew that we had it, and we knew how to use it, right? As opposed to Attica, where it was just like this new exposure kind of thing, and there was all this panic in response to that, right? So it was incredibly powerful for me in the cell house to manage offenders because they knew that we had that weapon system and that we would use it day to day. And so, it was just daily management of offenders.
Absolutely, that's what it boils down to. Yeah.
I began to see how powerful that security technology was, like this. These cool little weapon systems at a low level, and just presenting to the offender population, we have some power in the day-to-day management. But it wasn't something that would kill them, and it wasn't something that would hurt an officer. Like, we had all this interesting advantage starting to take position in managing offenders when these cool weapon systems start getting developed.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I'm concerned about is the turn of events, I think, in the last few years. And particularly, I'm doing 2 cases as an expert in 2 riots in the Nebraska Department of Corrections at the Tecumseh Correctional Institute. And what's bothering me is I have seen instance of as inmates began to riot under the influence of a heavy amount of homemade brew, burst out in the main yard. The officer there was one tower, the officer from the tower fired a warning shot. Inmates went down as they're supposed to on their face, and then within a few minutes jumped back up again and continued to try to break windows and destroy things. And so the officer kind of focused on the ringleader and fired again. He hit the inmate in the leg, and he went down. and he was, he survived and all that. But after he fired, hit the inmate in the leg, that didn't stop them either. They continued to riot. So it's really hard to say, what type of force is appropriate and when is it going to work. Yeah. Before that officer fired from the tower, an officer who was out there trying to say, hey, people, go lock up, you need to return. They jumped that officer and beat on him. They didn't seriously injure him, but he was definitely assaulted. Mm-hmm. And that happened twice, I think, before they announced the riot statewide. So, yeah, it's hard to make that judgment. What's going to work and what might not work. Yeah. Door control, lighting, body cam, all of it is erupted. And at Buena Vista, we had the worst lighting system in the world, and then we got the best lighting system, and then the entire community didn't like it. They thought it was too bright. And then I changed jobs. I transferred to Kansas City and left that with Warren Diesel and Gary Neat to deal with. But I just said, it's too dark here. We can't see people outside the cell block. We can't see people trying to escape through the perimeter. If an officer's in trouble and can't communicate, we don't even know it because we can't see it. I consulted with Wyoming Department of Corrections at the state penitentiary when they had at the event of 3 inmates that went through the perimeter, and they ran for about 200 miles south because there's no place to stop from there in Wyoming. It's just jackrabbits and mule deer. And the one thing we told this prison, we were there, on graveyard shift, and everybody's in darkness inside the compound. And not only is everybody in darkness, but their high security side is completely released. Inmates are just wandering around in the dark on the north side of the facility. Officer was killed there. It was probably the dirtiest, most disruptive facility. It's not the most, but one of the most that I've ever been in. And it's, I don't know, what was the question again?
It's kind of interesting that you say that also, because so many of the states in the United States have antiquated prison environments, even 19th century prison environments, that they still maintain operations for because they can't really outgrow it, right? The prison population is so big, they have never been able to let it go. And so they're trying to, even the lessons we're learning on how to control that great big contemporary beast, they're having to try and apply these concepts, right? Lighting, new ideas for door management, all of these interesting strategies to a 19th century prison environment. That's interesting to me.
It is, particularly since most of those places have no HC.
Mm-hmm.
They have
HVAC systems.
HVAC systems. They don't have them.
The gas, things like
and
that.
I've been in cell blocks before that. I had a hard time staying there because trouble breathing from the heat. And I can't imagine how a human being would live in that environment.
And their old door systems, things like that. So the great irony there is, in Colorado is no exception of that, really, because we have 19th century prisons in Colorado, but we also have brand new complexes like Sterling. And we have, a singular department executive level leadership managing emergencies for all of these collective environments and writing policy, to control offender populations in both of those comparative environments at the same time with these weapon systems. So that also, that's the contemporary correction scenario, right?
Yeah, most of those places have been renovated inside and out. The most extreme example I saw was when I interviewed for the job as a warden at Iowa State Penitentiary. For some reason, I decided to go interview and I've never seen anything like it. I mean, they took a huge, antiquated, block structure, medieval block structure, and they subdivided it. They divided it down the middle, they divided it lengthwise, and they, instead of one housing unit, they had 16. And I thought, wow, okay, that was one effort. I don't think it worked very well because it's so staff intensive and all that kind of stuff. But do is they try to engineer those things to act like modern buildings, and it's not always successful.
Yeah.
So, yeah, tour reporting, county jails, you see officers walking around with iPads, and the software is all there. Software is a huge part of this issue of technology. It didn't exist then, it exists now. It just costs money, and you have to be pretty persuasive with your legislators to get it. Okay, I ran across this article in Atlantic Monthly that really got my attention. And it says as follows: sustained prison uprisings simply do not happen here anymore. I think this was written in 2003. We had, in 1973, we had 93 riots for every 1 million prisoners. I'm sorry, I wrote riots in there. It should be homicides. 93 homicides for every 1 million prisoners in 1973. 30 years later, we had fewer than 3. So we went from 95 to 3, which I think is a 95% reduction in 30 years of homicides. And this article went on to talk about how well prepared ERT team members and weapons teams members were at the Moundsville State Prison riot. It's a riot control competition held worldwide, sponsored by the federal government, and that incidentally was the last major prison to have a riot. And so they have all these exercises in this prison from teams all over the United States and the world, and then vendors come in with their technologies and on and on and on. The guys I used to work for in DC were the sponsors of that organization. They wanted me to step up and bring the whole thing to Santa Fe, which is available for that kind of stuff. But I decided no, I don't want to do that. And that's the whole point. I think the changes we've made from back, starting from Connecticut, and Santa Fe, most of the decade of the 80s contains the rest of the riots. I picked these two out because we did feature them in the book as important riots. And if you understand pretty much everything in those books about Attica and Santa Fe, you'll understand a whole lot about other riots.
It's interesting also too to me because it really provides a picture. When you start looking at riots over the course of our American history, it really provides a picture of the best practices that are in place today, and now some of the interesting, like normalization, some of those concepts that are coming about now could only happen because of the lessons learned out of those years that you're referencing. Because best practices has been established, and it's so exceptional. The models are so exceptional.
Well, they are.
Management of these incidents now that we can consider other things. We can go on in other directions because of the lessons learned.
Well, I agree with that, but I have another concern that I've just been starting to think about lately. I'm involved as an expert in cases related to 2 riots in Nebraska, and and Nebraska borrowed most of what we developed here in Colorado, took it to Nebraska, and I love it, because I think it's the best answer for responding to emergencies. What bothers me is, so far, all the documentation, I don't know if I can say this, but all the documentation in Nebraska submitted related to those lawsuits doesn't talk about a cause.
A triggering event, or
Underlying cause. The film had a whole bunch of that stuff, and that was a real good listing. But nobody in that state wants to talk about the cause. And that's okay. As an expert, if they want to go there, that's fine by me. Because I don't think it was that strongly related to the disturbance. But I find people who talk about riots as a service to state agencies are reluctant to do that, to talk about cause. Because if I say these three things happened, and Director so-and-so was involved at the time, that could be used a bit, and I'm doing business with that person. So I don't have a lot of evidence on cause as a result of that. One thing that does kind of bother me, and I will say I've seen this in other states, is inmates who are serving their sentences, and this is like 5% to 8% of the total population. I've been given reason to believe that they can get out of prison if they just are aggressive and angry enough. Or they can get special treatment if they are aggressive and angry enough. Now, I'm not used to that. And when I worked in corrections, we had a lot of bad actors, but 95% of the inmates are pretty good people. It was that 5% that bothered me. But what they have in Nebraska is a whole larger quantity of inmates basically standing up and saying, F you, I'm not going to do what you want, even if it's a reasonable thing. I watched a body camera tape of a female corporal trying to escort this inmate to a cell and shake him down in the presence of other staff, and he refused. I mean, the profanity was just outrageous, and all the inmates in the cell block were doing it. She called an emergency alert to the shift commander, and there were inmates all over the tiers threatening, cursing and threatening harm and that kind of stuff. I'm not used to that. I mean, if it was that at Buena Vista, we'd have a whole lot of people in the hole, and we'd call out the National Guard, that we would not put up with that. So, but the interesting and most ironic thing, that was going on in New York. Okay, that was during the Civil Rights Revolution, and there were a lot of civil rights groups talking to these inmates and saying, you don't have to put up with that shit. You know, they'll just send you to a foreign country. Well, that never happened, and it never would happen. And they wouldn't grant them immunity. But it was the aggression that was there that you don't see in every prison. And I've seen it elsewhere, and it bothers me.
Would you, right now, we talk about a lot in class, that in American corrections there's a radical swing from the custodial model into the rehabilitative model right now, over the last, maybe 10 years. We're reforming all of these supermax environments. And we're pushing a lot of those high custody people that we used to house in supermax environments. We don't like that anymore, so we're pushing them into medium custody facilities, which is elevating the level of violence. Would you say that some of those things are parallel to this, to what you're seeing in corrections right now? That
most definitely, because the trend, the political
trends.
If you want to be nice in front of the cameras at a national level, you empty out your segregation units and turn all the bad actors
that's
loose.
Interesting.
Where the correctional officers have spent maybe a decade mounting the evidence against that person to isolate them because of the harm they're doing in general population. That is prison reform. I have to say this, but prison reform in general has no end in mind, except, in my opinion, the end in mind that the prison reform groups think about is eliminating prisons from the face of the United States, and I just don't see that happening as long as bad inmates choose to do bad things. We got to isolate them somehow, because I don't want them in my neighborhood. I don't think any of you want them in your neighborhood as well. You know, so we have to do something. But prison reform really is focusing on getting rid of all the safety and security stuff that we've built over the last 10 years.
That's incredibly ironic, isn't it? That we've established these best practices out of some of these events, and it has opened us up to the idea of new ideas, like normalization, like reforms. And the great irony is that it ultimately causes us to relive our lessons.
Absolutely. Well, it goes even beyond that. When you delineate all the things in the prison that would help it run in a healthy, happy, None of that happens unless all the security and safety stuff is in place. The security and safety stuff is sort of like the envelope. And when it's there, then you can bring in programs and you can be more flexible in your rules and regulations. But if it is systematically torn down by people outside of corrections, then we have to start all over again by the pendulum swings again, and we have to start rebuilding it. And I've said it in print. I've said there is absolutely no conflict between good security that works and flexibility and inmates having a positive, highly programmatic time in prison. There's no conflict. There isn't. The only conflict is created by people who want to convince us that there's a problem and do their best to do that. I'm pontificating, folks, but
You have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. So
Yeah.
you mentioned underlying meaning earlier. Throughout this presentation, you gave out the policies were all made by leadership, by congressional, or by the warden and up for the policies of the prison itself. Have you ever thought of a way to maybe let the prisoners actually make up their own policy so they can diffuse their own situation as well, to let them problem solve?
nah, I would never do that.
But,
I would never support that. Yeah.
Okay, well, I was just gonna say, because I compared to like a Norwegian documentary where they actually let the prisoners kind of do that same model, it shows more success and less recidivism back as well. So I was curious from your perspective.
Well, I'm very curious about that because that perspective in Europe, and especially Northern Europe, has been there for years.
Mm-hmm.
And we in America have been heavily criticized by Europeans for locking up so many people.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know for a fact, through a personal friend who was there, that Europe is, well, the UK was the example that their crime rate has gone through the ceiling. And now citizens are very upset about that because of the liberal policy towards releasing inmates back into the environment. So, you know, I don't know if there's any easy answers. If anybody remembers in the 50s and 60s, we were all about rehabilitation in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
We were all about it, and universities studied it, and the data showed it wasn't working at all. And we got into, we heard about a few programs, especially like 7 Habits and the cognitive restructuring programs that allow inmates to be different in a positive way, as the only breakthrough I know of in serious inmate programming that makes sense.
Norway is incredibly interesting,
Yeah.
actually. But that, you know, all of us have taken a pretty close look at Norway.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of conflicts in the comparison. For example, Norway's offender population is incredibly mild compared to most American correctional populations. Their classification is incredibly mild.
Mm-hmm.
Their prison population numbers are incredibly small in comparison. Their staffing is advanced where ours is depleted in American corrections right now. So some of those conflicting variables there, for me, really stand out in challenging the comparison in operations for Norway.
Well, yeah, and that friend of mine that was in the UK at a convention, international convention of correctional professionals, and he was told by some of the people from Great Britain that they're having all kinds of hell to pay on the streets because of all the offenders they've been releasing with that philosophy in mind, and it's not working for them, and the backlash is significant. I haven't kept up with it since that time, but so yeah, that's why you're all here. You're going to get an education in criminal justice, and you know, it'll remain important for the rest of your careers. I don't think there's any perfect example. We've got model examples to pay attention to, but the putting inmates back in civilian clothes, treating them as though they were non-criminal personality, looking for good results in doing that, by itself I don't think is the answer, because we tried that. We had inmates, all the inmates in Buena Vista were coming from the reformatory mode, were in civilian clothes, and
Yeah.
we made the
Did it at
decision to
women's, yeah.
get them out because we were beginning to chase them as fugitives, and we didn't want to. If we had to use lethal force, we certainly didn't want to use it on someone who was a citizen.
Well, gosh, thank you so much. Are there any other questions for Mr. Atherton? Can you think about some of these interesting corrections dynamics this morning?
As I explained earlier, our purpose in doing that, the hot button issues, presentations such as this, is to just center on some critical issues in corrections that probably need a little bit more treatment that you would like to see. So you have any ideas about future events like this and what topics we should focus on, please let Katie know. And she and I will talk about that, because my first impression that in thinking about this a few months ago is there's just, the world is loaded with very hot topics you see in the newspaper every day. Crowded conditions, what's really crowded? I mean, who's defining that and how does it get defined? Because it's going to court, I guarantee you. It's going to court as we speak, and it has in the past. But it's very foggy about what real crowding is. We had visitors from Japan a few years back that come to the Sterling Correctional Facility to see how we were doing things, prompted by the World Human Rights Organization. And they said, "Wow, you guys got it great here." And they looked at our cell and they said, in a cell that size, we have 6 people. And of course, we had nothing to say about that. I mean, it's a different culture, it's a different world. Yeah, different attitude.
Well, if you would like to take advantage of his reading list, I have enjoyed Gina Atherton reading lists for many years. So if you would like to, read more about Attica and Santa Fe, please come up and see Gene, shake his hand. Please help me thank him for